Welcome to the American Academy of Grief Counseling's video on counseling and ethical pitfalls. Now, this is a second part video to the first ethics course for the first ethics video, and the course that some of you may be taking, especially those of you who are not licensed counselors who need some ethical background in regards to counseling itself. Now, this particular video is going to look at a little bit more in detail ethical pitfalls that can befall licensed or unlicensed counselors in particular spots and areas and how to better avoid it. Many of these situations are gray areas. And secondly, many of these situations can be avoided through understanding of what type of preparation needs to be done, as well as what type of documentation needs to be done. So documentation is always key in counseling. The more you document, the better. The first concept we want to explore is competency. Competency refers to your abilities and properly advertising yourself within those abilities. Never working outside of one specialty is the beginning of it all. If you are a specialist in grief, that's fine. If you have an individual who's coming to you for something other than grief, and you don't feel you have a strong grasp of it, or it's not your specialty, a referral is important in that regard. Some counselors are more generally educated and can handle a broader variety. But as we go further and deeper down into a specialty, just like any physical illness, well, then a competency within that is always better because a specialist knows more details than a general physician would. The same holds true in counseling, although if it's a minor issue, usually a counselor has a more wider range net of knowledge that they can give and aid the client in. But if you feel as a counselor that you are working outside of your specialty and you're uncomfortable, then a referral is definitely necessary. So you never want to advertise yourself as something you are not. And you always want to be transparent with clients regarding your limitations of your particular abilities. Advertising yourself as something you're not is very important, especially for non-licensed counselors, those who are maybe working under the guidance of a licensed counselor or an agency, but you yourself may not be licensed. Or if you're working at a pastoral setting as a Christian counselor or as a simple grief counselor, you have to adhere to your limitations granted by the state. So a licensed counselor can treat pathology. A psychologist can treat pathology. A psychiatrist can treat pathology and also prescribe. But if you're an unlicensed counselor, you are only dealing with human loss and grief, or human problems in spiritual counseling, or basic reactions of our human emotions and giving guidance to those. You are in no way, shape, or form a licensed professional counselor. To advertise yourself as that or allow yourself to be perceived as that is unethical and also can lead you into some serious legal issues. So if you're not a licensed counselor, you don't meet the state's guidelines of education. They're prerequisites for usually a minimum of a master's degree in counseling or human service or social work, and you have not passed the exam by the state, then you have no right to describe yourself as a licensed professional counselor. Now, in regards to competency, sometimes licensed counselors can serve as a third party in regards to interviewing potential individuals for whatever purpose that the agency is looking for. Maybe they're talking to other employees within an agency and a certain healthcare worker has been brought in mental health to do interviews and counseling sessions. Maybe it's working with the state or local municipality or a particular authority within the judicial system. And you're being asked to give your ideas, your professional assertion on this particular individual. And this is where transparency has to be very open. And this is where we look at veracity, where you as that type of counselor is also letting the person you're working with know that there are certain limitations of what you have and what you have with your employer has certain expectations from you as well. So this is a situation where transparency is important to show your competency. In regards to any types of reporting, documentating as well for your own personal records, you want your reports to be comprehensive. You want to adhere to standards and regulations and any type of approved methodologies. Be humble and admit any limitations, and that'll keep you out of a lot more trouble than not. Never submit opinions via third-party disclosures, but investigate the source itself and attempt to avoid bias in reporting. And this can be difficult sometimes if you're just working with one client and you're maybe in a case where there's custody of a minor child, and you have to give a disclosure of things that happened, and you need to be sure to avoid bias and simply stick to the facts. Second concept that's important, and if not properly guarded, can lead to major pitfalls for your professional career, is confidentiality. Confidentiality refers to when you're working with your client not to reveal sensitive information. And this is where the informed consent forms are critical, and what lists the idea of what you're about to do with us has these set standards, and this type of confidentiality is attached to it. So this confidentiality has to exist, because if confidentiality does not exist, then the very foundation of counseling crumbles. There has to be a circle of trust. There has to be fidelity as well as veracity, qualities that we discussed in a previous video that are important for counseling to happen. However, there are limits to confidentiality within counseling itself, licensed and unlicensed. There is a thing referred to as mandatory reporting, which refers to having to report if someone is a harm to themselves or harm to others, whether a crime has occurred, maybe murder, molestation, or otherwise, unless one is required and subpoenaed by court under penalty of law not to discuss. So these limits of confidentiality should be listed in the intent forms, and they also should be reminded to the client at the start and throughout and at the very end about these limitations. If you feel an individual is about to reveal a deep, deep secret that is more so than what the counseling content has been between you and him or her, then you would want to gently remind them of your limits of confidentiality and mandatory reporting before they choose to disclose. Because sometimes clients think everything is protected with a counselor, and it simply isn't. Now, as you go up into pastoral settings, there are some regulations from the state that have pastor penitent exemptions, where it's a little bit more strict in terms of reporting, but it is still permitted. And then we have the seal of confession, which literally is a sacred sacrament within the eyes of the church, the Catholic Church, and is something that can never be dispelled. So we have priests who are bound by the seal of confession. And even if there is harm, they are not allowed to reveal in regards to the name of the person and so forth. They can give maybe subtle warnings if they feel someone might be harmed, but they are very restricted in what they can do. There have been priests who've actually died over the seal of confession. In the Middle Ages, St. Edward the Confessor himself refused to tell the king the Queen's confession and was executed over it. So that is a very strong seal because it's religious in nature. The pastor penitent is not as sacred as confession would be, so there is a little bit more leeway. But in terms of secular counseling, whether you're licensed or unlicensed and you're not a pastor, then you fall under mandatory reporting, and is a very strict rule that cannot be avoided. In addition, individuals can get into a lot of trouble for not keeping secure records, counselors being that. Records that can get hacked sometimes aren't your fault, but it's important to have the necessary electronic antivirus protections for your computer or your record keeping, passwords to avoid individuals who might try to break into your computer. Paperwork should be under lock and key, and you need to be extremely careful what you have on your desk for other colleagues, coworkers, or other clients who might walk in. These things need to be secured. And if you do not follow proper protocol in securing these records, you can again fall into some trouble in regards to your standards of care. Now, there are also conflicts of interest, which are very gray. We can't always just have an individual that we do not know or does not know anyone that we know come in and not have any bias or other conflicts. And this is especially more true in smaller towns where somebody might be a cousin of your client or a friend of your client. One thing that we do need to watch out is having family and friends be our clients, because that can also bias our own mind in regards to treating them. It can also put bias in regards to how we treat other clients as compared to them. So it's important to know third parties that exist in and out of our counseling relationship. In regards to when representing the state, it's important for us to be transparent. If we are representing another party, we need to let the individual that we're working with know who we're representing and what our end goal and aim is. Outside of business also can cause a conflict of interest. If you're working with a business partner, or if you're working maybe as an individual who has another side trade and you're selling something, or someone is selling something to you that you might be seeing, or if you're working in other areas, maybe you are working in the school system, or you know the individual through some other type of transaction. Well, maybe not friends, but there is some type of connection that can occur. Now, while these are unintentional sometimes, it's important to be aware of them ethically and not allow them to dirty our hands. Now, there are times when we can go into completely improper relationships. And this has a problem with not only not causing no harm, we want to cause the best effects for our client. But if there's a relationship involved between us and the client, that can only cause malfeasance. There can be no beneficence in that at all, because it puts us as the counselor in a situation, a position of power over the client. And it definitely will put bias in our mind in regards to what the individual wants to do. If romantic relationships do occur, then the counseling relationship has to end. So it's important then, when dealing with someone, to be very sterile, not to take more emotional interest in one over the other. And sometimes that might be difficult due to the dynamics of the individual and yourself, but you need to take a seat back and understand what's going on. And this is why it's also important how you come across, because individuals can become attracted to those in power and you may not even recognize it. Or maybe you simply putting your hand on the client's hand to console them can lead to misinformed intents, where an individual thinks that you are actually being romantic in that particular case. So the influence of the power over the client is an issue of autonomy, because it can affect them from making their own decisions. So we always want to avoid these types of relationships that become romantic, or even events outside of counseling. Now, in some cases, cultures do give gifts to professionals who help them. You might have a client who even just brings cookies or a piece of cake. This might seem innocent, but it can also cause a bias, an imbalance, where you might view this client differently than another because they did this extra thing for you, even as small as cookies. So in terms of that, it needs to be watched. You want to keep it as professional as possible between payment and counseling. The payment is the monetary compensation for your time and services, not side gifts, which can be misconstrued and later lead to a misrepresentation, or it can also lead to situations that can cause possible feelings on the other side of the aisle. And that's what we want to avoid. Now, certain cultures You got to know, you got to be diverse. You got to understand your cultural base. And that's why there's a lot of diversity training nowadays for counselors. But in accepting gifts from certain cultures, it might be considered a slap in the face, an insult to the individual. So you want to also weigh that in. So again, it's a gray area that you need to very carefully monitor. If you do have that come across, you might also have a gray area with your employer who has a strict policy of not accepting gifts. Then you would be tied between two situations, one of offending a client and the other of disobeying a direct policy, which is something you need to adhere to. So conversation, communication, transparency with all parties involved can sometimes rectify these difficult situations that you might have to navigate that might make you feel a little uncomfortable. Our final thing that we want to look at is abandonment or termination. And many counselors can get into issues with this where the client feels that they were abandoned or left. And one way to resolve that is having fixed timelines. Fixed timelines sometimes happen on the first day. They're discussed, how many sessions you plan to do and what the results are supposed to look like within a fair assessment. If that happens, then there's less likelihood of someone feeling abandoned. Also, in terms of your assessments of care, of what you're promising, also being very direct on how payments are, and also the necessity of referrals sometimes. So if an individual falls into your orbit and maybe they do not click with you, you can work with them to find another counselor. But you never want to drop them immediately or abandon them because they're coming to you for help. And ethically, you are to cause no harm. You are to be there for them and to guide them. So you might have some situations where in Christian counseling, which is a non-licensed field, you still have ethics to an individual who might not be adhering to a particular moral precept of Christianity. In case you cannot just drop this client, you have to respect their autonomy. You have to guide them to come to a common conclusion. Again, we're teaching them to fish. We're not giving them fish, so to speak. You're teaching a person how to better themselves and to come to logical conclusions and to better themselves mentally. So abandoning does not help just because we're upset. So if there's ever a case where there's incompatibility, it has to be done very slowly and with common ground with your client, and then finding someone who's willing or more able to handle the conversation that you're having. But again, fixed timelines, fair assessments, understanding of policies, all in the informed consent on the day one can prevent a lot of these issues. So these are common pitfalls that new counselors have, and even experienced counselors. There are always gray areas. I mean, the standards are clear for the American Counseling Association or the NASW or these other organizations within the human service field. But sometimes these standards also have a variety of gray areas where one standard says this, the other standard says that. So you can find yourself in a little bit of a conflict of interest and not really know where to go. So you adhere to your standards, but you also adhere to your conscience, your own moral code. And usually that will guide you right. But adhering to veracity, fidelity, justice, doing no harm, only causing good for your client, and respecting the autonomy of the client and following these rules in regards with competency, in regards to confidentiality, in conflict of interests, improper relationships, and understanding of termination or releasing a client. These are all things that are very important ethically and also professionally and legally for a counselor to adhere to. So this video served to supplement the first, hopefully in a little bit more detail, a little bit more discussion, especially for those who have to take this course that are not licensed in ethics, or those who are taking it because they want to have a refresher on ethics. For those of you who might just be watching the video from public domain, that is fine as well, because these principles are very important for any of us who are entering the professional field of counseling itself. Below are some of our certifications, grief and Christian. There's links there. But we also have programs in crisis, stress, and anger as well. So take a look at all of AIHCP's behavioral certifications, mental health certifications. Our phone number is 330-652-7776, and our email is info@aihcp.org. I'd like to thank you for listening and have a good day.